So what exactly are cleft nations? Cleft nations are defined as these nations where the subcultures are so diverse due to ethnicity, due to language, due to religion, due to geography, due to history really, that all leads to cultural divides that are clearly identifiable and usually very difficult to integrate, and specifically to integrate in one cultural metaphor. So Gannon and Pillay try to utilize some of the principles of identifying a metaphor and the associated pillars, and pretty much apply these to these difficult countries that have sometimes clear and sometimes blurred divisions among sectors or sects in their own nations. And remember at the beginning of the semester when we had mentioned that culture can be nation-specific and it could be subcultures within. This is where we get to the understanding in the semester that even within one country there are subcultures that still define the entire unity of the country, or maybe not. So the examples that are listed are ones that are the countries that in the textbook of Gannon and Pillay have actual specific metaphors and reference to: the Malaysian Balik Kampung, which is return to the roots, the Nigerian marketplace, the Israeli kibbutzim, and the Belgian lace, which had originally been an assigned reading that constitutes a cleft nation, is also supplemented with an additional chapter reading about the politics of Belgium. The title of the chapter that is assigned is Still Belgium. So we're going to go quickly through some of the highlights of some of these particular aspects. For most of these countries, they usually have a common in terms of the historical renditions, of the historical rationalizations for why these cultures have come to be almost subsets, if you will. So for example, with Malaysia gained independence from Britain in 1957, following the rule of divide and conquer kind of policy, has led to the creation of 3 distinct ethnic groups that have vast geographical and occupational dispersion. So see in that one sentence how much is unpacked in terms of what creates this division. The Malays representing 60% of the population, the Chinese representing 30% of the population, and the Indians representing 10% of the population. And under the British rule, the Chinese and Indians were particularly brought in from their different specializations in certain industries and segregated at a very early age with constant sort of reinforcement of these differences in educational practices, in occupational practices, even sometimes in terms of ideologies. And over the many decades since independence, there have been movements towards unification that sometimes are represented in the tourism sector, trying to promote the country as truly Asian with a mesh of all of these together. And the metaphor is very interesting in trying to identify and find what creates some form of harmony amongst these 3 groups, so that as an implication for international business, we might be respectful of each of these cultures, but when it comes to maybe finding what is common, that's what we're going to look at with using Balik Kampung. And particularly these 3 parts of the pillars themselves are ones that look at what these 3 different ethnic and religious groups sort of normalize when it comes to celebrations and sort of returning back to their roots when it comes to religious rituals. So between all of these 3 illustrations of the groups, there are different celebrations: the Muslim Hari Raya, the Chinese New Year celebration, of course, and the Indian Deepavali festival. What's common amongst them is the practice of giving money by elderlies most of the time, and specific family rituals that almost seem common across all of these sectors, even though they do have specific identification themes in each of these celebrations. So returning to nearby roots allows the metaphor to carry weight in this particular pillar. If we add to that the similarity in authority ranking, what we see from Hofstede's dimensions illustrate a number we haven't seen primarily in the past when it comes to a clear over 100, if not 100 metric for power distance by the Malaysian culture. And remember, this is an average, so that usually represents the numbers that are that reflects the numbers that are representative of all members, but not necessarily to one group over another. Individualism, of course, is quite low, showing a collectivist notion. And then what's really also differentiator sometimes that we think is worthy of looking at is the Globe study, which identified again still the presence of high power distance, and the type of leadership that works the best is charismatic and humane orientation. These are again similarities that are across the board for all of these different ethnic groups. So authority ranking happens to be part of the pillar that allows for this to make sense. And what they have in common also is the reinforcement of common values between all three ethnic minorities in this group. Even the Malays themselves, they do share the high context type of communication with an emphasis on saving face. And the implications for business operators, particular for IB and for international managers, is the importance of establishing long-term relationships, the importance of family and national loyalties, even though they might be representative of different groups within the country. Decision-making process takes longer, usually with the centralization at the point that's reflective of the power distance. And you still have to be mindful that there are certain traditions that might differentiate these groups' receptivity to the relationship building more than others. Another example of a cleft nation is Israel. And again, because this is an illustration of a culture in which various ethnic and religious groups experience some difficulty living comfortably with one another, the authors believe that this would be a representation of a cleft nation. Now, the history of the country itself originates in the modern understanding of Israel is the 1949 sort of conception of the country. It has been composed of many ethnicities, really, particularly tribes with some different viewpoints and lifestyles. Those that we hear politically about might be the differences, the difference of opinion in terms of the Israeli population versus the Palestinian population. 20% of the population is considered Palestinian. Of the 8.7 million population of Israel. But more importantly, even within the actual Palestinian population and within the Israeli population, there are different viewpoints and lifestyles within. The country, which is pretty small, constituted of 10 political parties, and the tension often is religious in history, but also because of political ramifications of these ideologies. The coexistence of Islam, Christianity, and Judaism in that very limited space of a creation of a country has been where most of our discussions about Cleft lie. The country itself instituted or built on the movement for the redemption of the Jewish people, and the pillars of the kibbutz are basic principles for life. And so the metaphor argues and postulates that these particular principles of the kibbutz in terms of community ownership, equality, democratic decision-making, communal responsibility, and group over individuals, those types of principles are maybe a foundation for understanding the Israeli culture in entirety. Even though this might not include the representation of these other ethnicities or tribes or religions, the three pillars of kibbutz metaphor are interesting to explain some of the Israeli cultural norms that impact some of the business operations in Israel. These are explicit values, size and behavioral outcomes, which is related to explicit values, and traumas and worldwide personality. If we look at Hofstad's dimensions, you'll see that they have a combination of a high, low uncertainty avoidance, and at the same time they have low power distance, which is very different from what we just saw from Malaysia. So you can see that that type of vertical collectivism is one that's not normalized in business and definitely in culture. And that actually is a good representation of the kibbutz metaphor, particularly that of equality, egalitarianism, and sort of almost shared norms. So in terms of explicit values, the country itself is built in such a way that it represents democracy as a parliamentary democracy, to be more accurate. There is some intertwining between the practice of the religion itself of Judaism and the government roles in terms of marriage, divorce, observance of Sabbath. The army's role is a very big part of the actual culture of the country, which illustrates also egalitarianism in terms of roles of gender in their participation in the army as well. And as we just mentioned, because there is a low distance practice, that doesn't necessarily mean that there is an actual value norm that you might see in globe that differentiates that from one another. And then if we look at the traumas and world values and worldview and personality, they are notorious for pretty much being fatalistic. There is no choice, and so there is very high uncertainty avoidance, and this has trickled into a very low context type of communication, very different from Malaysia as well, known as Dori type of personal style. And even though there is a sense of a changing culture moving from a collectivist well-being to sort of an individualistic type of society, the implications are very interesting for international business. Just like Brazilians, the Israelis are known to be very informal, and at the same time they're very warm, and physical touch and greetings is very common. It is a different type of communication, which is mostly low context. Punctuality is also kind of relaxed, so more on the polychronic type of timing, and relationships also take time. So that you can see in common with the Cleft Nation, and that's also because you can see of it in a high uncertainty avoidance context as well. If we take a look at Nigeria as another illustration of a Cleft nation, you'll notice that Nigeria shows some average scores when it comes to Hofstede's traditional dimensions. We usually a 60 or a 55. One is hovering around middle in terms of, for example, assertion here and uncertainty avoidance. What might grab your attention again is that power distance has gone up again, similar to Malaysia. And the individualism is one that begs more attention to look at globes, maybe African statistics. But what's common between Nigeria and what we earlier described in Malaysia is the history. And it's also gained independence from Britain in 1960. It is one of the most populous African countries. It is the largest, it is the most populous African country but in terms of size of population. It does have a low GDP per capita overall, and that's ironic because of its strong oil-based type of economy, where a largest number of intake of their revenue stems from their oil industry. But because of corruption and a sort of a systemic military rule, which ranks the corruption level to be high, there has been definitely a lot of despair in this country in terms of its potential in economic and growth, and definitely geopolitical in the African continent. So the three pillars that are also very interesting for delivering on what the marketplace metaphor is the diversity. And just like a marketplace, there is so much diversity in the actual fabric of the Nigerian culture. And there are roughly 300 ethnic, sometimes I think acknowledge much more, 300 ethnic and sub-ethnic groups that are divided by the two rivers, the Niger and the Benue. And the three particular cultural ethnic differences also translate into religious differences as well. And that has been sort of the essence of the heterogeneity itself in terms of linguistic, religion, social, cultural, physical, and even definitely economic development as well. If we look at some of these international comparisons, as we mentioned, you can see the high power distance, but because we always try to resolve what a number looks like when it's 30 on Hofstede's individualism construct, there is high institutional and in-group collectivism, but it's difficult to attribute to a certain practice or over one another. They are average on gender egalitarianism and above average on masculinity, which is assertiveness and working sort of practices. So when we look at diversity as a pillar, we can add to that some of these social dynamism, and the reason why this is important is because when we look at some of these commonalities that Nigeria has with other Western or high foreign direct investment countries' origins, you'll see that there's not much difference except for some of these cultural norms that might be about balancing tradition and change. There is a role for extended family. The roles of women are defined as well, almost as parallel with Western social welfare. And even though there remain religious conflicts between Muslims and Christians, there is a lot more structure in international business in the Nigerian business culture than we think. So Authoritative leadership is expected, but there's also a humane orientation valued that we can see from the Globe study. There is a tendency towards paternalism and hierarchy in organizations, which you can see here in the power distance, but rather than it being age and seniority, here it's more of the king paternalistic approach to leadership and to kind of ranking, I should say. And so what's important to look at these three metaphors is how can you establish something of a tradition that might look like it could be generalized to all of these subsectors or subgroups or subcultures in the country. Likewise, when we look at Belgium, Belgium had a metaphor that is the Belgian lace, which talks about the intricacy, the contrast, and sort of the difficulty of integrating and weaving something to be a very unified, beautiful outcome. We supplement that by looking at chapter 10 from this textbook about the politics of Belgium and its governance in particular. Some of the numbers that look interesting here are also uncertainty avoidance being high, but for the rest of the numbers and their indications, outside of the unit of Belgium, you'll see commonalities with Belgium. They're a very, very important participant in the EU, with NATO headquarters, with the representation that they have of the EU in Brussels, and because of its vast background in terms of rulings and which countries had a sort of a big footprint into Belgium, it has now created a federation of states. There are essentially three regional governments with identification of three national languages, Dutch, German, and French. And some of the differences that you see, if not divisions, that you see amongst these, particularly the Wallonians and the Dutch speaking, the Flemish, is particularly because of geographic, if not sort of social, economic division. So the Belgian lace was an interesting argument to look at the land of contrast. So there has been a struggle between individualism and belongingness to a group. The role that Belgium has played in the EU has allowed for that kind of resolution between individualism and collectivism, and that has helped a lot. So they do acknowledge the importance of belonging to the bigger union that is Europe as well. And there's always sort of a question about control. It's more like a doing society, and also I think that's really important to think about some of their contrasts that we brought up in our discussion with our guest speaker, and then you'll also see in the reading of Still Belgium. So, what most Belgians are known to be is they are truly born negotiators because they have a natural participative nature of concessions. Their communication styles sometimes differ between the major groups. So the Flemings tend more towards direct speech than the Wallonians, who sort of have this French-like kind of rhetoric. But in general, because both of these, again, constitute more of a European approach to communication, you'll see that these definitely are more low context than some of those that we just explained in terms of maybe the example of Malaysia. And pretty much, as has been established from all of the readings, is there's a variance in terms of how divided these subcultures can be, but the potential of policy success in unifying this bipolarity is the question that we present from our argument here, and doesn't matter for international business executives if we look at these metaphors and these examples.